Hi guys, welcome to Top Psych Tutoring. Today we're going to be going through MILGRAM study, which is the first study of the OCR A-level spec. I'm just going to tell you guys the main points of the study and also act as a revision resource. The social area involves MILGRAM, Bocchiaro, Piliavin and Levine studies. Now, the first two link to the key theme of responses to people in authority, and the latter two link to responses to people in need. So these are key themes which you need to know, because in the exam they can ask you to link any of these studies to the key themes as well as linking it to the social area. I will go through this in another video and I'll give you guys examples on how to do this. But for now, let's talk about MILGRAM study. So MILGRAM wanted to determine the motives of German soldiers killing millions of innocent people. Was it because they were inherently evil, or did they just want to obey the authority figures such as their commanders? MILGRAM inherently believed that the situation and the inclination to obey the authority figure was something that led them to commit these atrocities. Now, when we look at the situational versus dispositional debate, dispositional attribution argues that the cause of behaviour is due to a person's own personality, and the situational side says the latter. And it says that the behaviour is due to the situation outside someone's control. For example, the authority figure. And MILGRAM really believed that it was the situational side of the debate that these behaviours demonstrated. Now, the aim is to investigate the level of obedience shown by participants when told by an authority figure to administer shocks to another person. I would say it'd be very helpful for you to learn this word for word, because of course there's many key words in this, and I think this is the only part of the spec you need to know word for word. Make sure you make a flashcard of this and highlight this in your brains. So, we have the method and design. I think many people do assume it's an experiment, but it is a controlled observational study because there are no conditions. Everybody took part in all the same conditions. There was no IV, there was no manipulation. Everybody went through the same experience. So it is a controlled observational study. They collected both quantitative and qualitative data, and I've also basically quantified on how they've done that in brackets, because they can ask you a question like that in the exam. The sample was 40 males aged 20 to 50 from the New Haven area in the US. They were from a wide range of occupations. The method that they used to collect this sample was self-selected / volunteering, whatever you guys call it, as they were gained through a newspaper and direct mail advertisements. What they did is they posted letters in the mailboxes of these participants, and they found out from there. They were then paid $4.5 for agreeing to participate regardless of what occurred in the experiment. So it meant that they were going to be paid regardless of what they did, whether they obeyed or they disobeyed. So the procedure, it is quite jam-packed, but I wanted to make sure that I had all the detail here that you're able to use in your exam, because MILGRAM is quite a popular one on the recent exams in the past few years. So there was a fake shock generator. In the 1960s, the generator looked impressive and realistic. And these are all the features that they had. I won't read them out loud. I'll let you guys process that your guys yourself. And we also have the setting and the briefing. The study took place in a psychology lab in Yale University. Now, it's very important to note down where it was taken, because I feel like this really helps you to remember the details of each study, because a lot of the course studies of the OCR A-level spec, they are taking place in universities. So when you're able to remember where it was taking place, it's quite easy to remember the study as well. So there was a participant, of course, and then there was an experimenter who was played by a biology teacher and introduced himself as Jack Williams, and he had a technician coat and stern expression. So this kind of represented how he was an authority figure, and it created the idea that he was authoritative and he was quite demanding. The predetermined learner or victim was played by Mr. Wallace. He was also an actor, and he was a 47-year-old accountant. Only one real participant was used in each trial. They were then provided a cover story involving the impact of punishment on learning. So this is what they told the participant and what they would be doing. I'll let you guys read that through. And in the starting, the participant was asked to draw a slip of paper out of the hat to determine their role. But of course it was rigged, so they would always get the teacher and Mr. Wallace would always be the learner. So this meant that the participant was always in the position of administering the shocks, and then therefore MILGRAM would be able to find how much they would obey. So the learner was strapped into an electric chair. It was very, very realistic for the time this was set in, and it'd be very good if you guys took notes of the details that occurred within the experiment. So when we continue the procedure, it's a very long procedure. A lot of the chunk of this study is the procedure. So we have the memory game. The participant, the teacher, seated in an adjacent room in front of a shock generator, was asked to read a series of word pairs to memorize. To test, the first words of the pair and 3 other words were read out loud. The learner had to indicate which was originally paired with the word. If wrong, the participant told learner a correct answer and the level of punishment. So, for every wrong answer, the participant required to move one scale up the shocks. In all conditions, learners gave a predetermined responses with approximately 3 to 1 answer. At 300 volts, Mr. Wallace pounded on the wall, complained of his heart condition, and the responses stopped. Participants told to treat no response as an incorrect answer and to continue shocking. Now, these are the type of prods that were used if, for example, they expressed that they wanted to stop or that they were struggling to go on. So the experimenter, who was Jack Williams, would first start with the prod 1 by saying, please continue or please go on. Then he'd work through all 4 of the prods to kind of encourage the participant to obey to his commands and continue shocking the learner. He also used a special prod. Although shocks might be painful, there's no permanent tissue damage, so please go on. Sorry, that should say no, but yeah, there's no permanent tissue damage. So this was to reassure the participant that there'd be no permanent tissue damage, even though the learner himself expressed a lot of pain. So it was up to the participant themselves whether they wanted to obey or not. In the end, if the participant broke off before 450 volts, so for example, if they stopped obeying to all of the commands, then they would be classified as defiant, while those who obeyed to the full 450 volts were classified as obedient. And then all of the ethical stuff was carried out. So the results were that 65% of participants administered shocks up to 450 volts, making them obedient. 35% were defiant as they administered up to less than 450 volts. Now, the qualitative data is very valuable in this study because it showed how difficult it was for them to obey to the authority figure because it truly went against their morals. So the obedient participants heaved sighs of relief or shook their heads. A lot of them dug their fingernails into their flesh, and a lot of them also had nervous laughing fits, which was very unpredictable and it was quite bizarre. And also the comments really reflect what the participants were feeling. So one of the participants said, I don't think this is very humane. Oh, I can't carry on with this. I'd like to continue, but I can't do that to a man. I'll hurt his heart. You take your money. The evaluation is a key point of this because you can use this in many of the sections in the exam paper. So the first strength was they were able to administer high control. So the participants truly believed they were randomly assigned the role of the teacher or the learner. And they also included the same shock generator and the learner was always Mr. Wallace. This all increases the validity of the study as it ensures that the participant truly believed that this was real and it ensured that they didn't know that this was all just a setup. The high validity, of course, in itself is a strength because, of course, they believed that the situation was real, that MILGRAM was measuring actual levels of obedience. Quantitative data is objective and qualitative data allowed MILGRAM to gain an understanding behind the behaviour and levels of obedience shown. The ethics were protecting the participants from harm, as a number of psychometric measures were used and they were also reunited with Mr. Wallace to show he wasn't harmed at the end of the study. Now, ethics is a very pretentious subject in this study because MILGRAM's study is generally known to be unethical because, first of all, he deceived the participants and made them believe they were administering real electric shocks to a participant and that they were investigating punishment and learning. The protection from harm can be questioned because there was inadequate measures to protect participants from stress, which they expressed through the qualitative data that we saw. It was an unrepresentative sample because MILGRAM only used American men, which can be classified as androcentric. This is when a sample only involves men, and not everyone could have seen the newspaper advertisement, which means that it might have been biased. Those who may like participating in studies just may have participated. and it also lacked ecological validity. It was carried out in an artificial setting, of course, in a lab in a university. You may be wondering why I've put counter arguments to the weaknesses, because you necessarily don't need to know this for section A of the paper, where they ask you just about the content and details of each study, but it's very important in section B, where they may ask you about certain debates or issues, debates such as situational versus dispositional debate, or issues such as ecological validity. And it's very important to use study evidence, but you also have to have counter arguments for each of these points. So for example, if we're talking about this study lacking ecological validity, you can say it doesn't necessarily lack ecological validity because less artificial studies, such as Hoffling study, showed a majority decision in obedience. So the nurses asked to give potentially lethal injections to patients by a doctor over the phone. Most nurses complied, which means that obedience is universal, and a lot of people have the tendency to obey authority figures, and when they're in a situation where they have to obey to authority figure, they will do, regardless of their dispositional attributes or what their inner morals say. Now, I can also say that the sample isn't unrepresentative and androcentric because the participants were men and they were selected from a variety of ages and backgrounds. And also, another thing to point is cross-cultural replications of MILGRAM study also found similar results, which means that the results are generalizable to other members of the world and that it isn't ethnocentric. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate your time and I hope this is a good resource for your OCR A-level psychology revision, and I hope it helped you guys today.